Now it's time to run our Spark application on a real hardware cluster using Amazon EMR. In this chapter, if you want to do the practical exercise along with me, then I'm going to assume that you already have an account with Amazon AWS and that you're familiar with AWS. If you don't have an account with Amazon Web Services, then please don't worry. You do not need to do this chapter to carry on with the rest of the course. But I would recommend that you watch the video anyway, because there's going to be some useful insights to Spark in this chapter, and it will be good for you to get a feel for what Amazon Web Services can do for you, and you'll be amazed really at how easy it is to set up a real live complicated Spark cluster with just a few mouse clicks. There are, of course, a lot of courses available on Udemy that cover the basics of Amazon Web Services, so you could certainly pick up a good tutorial on how to get yourself an account at AWS, and you could pretty quickly pick up the basics from there. You do need to know what you're doing with AWS, because everything that we do in this chapter is going to incur costs. And if you fail to delete and terminate any of the resources that we use in this chapter, you will be billed. And I am not going to be held responsible for that. This is entirely your responsibility. In particular, when working with clusters, they can be particularly expensive. So the object of this exercise then is to deploy our keyword counting application to live hardware. Now, I'm only using Amazon AWS because that's what I'm familiar with, and it's what we use at Virtual Pair Programmers behind the scenes for our hardware infrastructure. And you have a lot of options as to how you deploy your Spark jobs. But basically what you need is some kind of a cluster manager. Now, Spark supports the Hadoop cluster manager. So you might be familiar with Hadoop, and you might have even done our training course at Virtual Pair Programmers on Hadoop. And you'll know from that course that Hadoop is not just MapReduce. Hadoop is a kind of a collection of tools, one of which is MapReduce, but there's also the HDFS file system as part of Hadoop. And there is also a cluster manager called Yarn. Now, what we can do with Spark, well, we don't need Hadoop MapReduce, but with Spark, we can deploy Spark to an Hadoop cluster, maybe using HDFS, but we can also take advantage of the Yarn cluster manager. So if you're setting up a cluster by hand, then basically you could set up a cluster in the same way that you would set up a Hadoop cluster. You could also use the existing AWS service called EMR, which is on their list of services here. Now, EMR stands for Elastic MapReduce, and it's basically Amazon's implementation of Hadoop in the cloud. So as I say, we don't need the Hadoop MapReduce, but we can take advantage of these Amazon EMR clusters to run our Spark jobs. And it's not too difficult to set up a cluster. So as I keep saying, either just watch the video and enjoy having a good relax, or if you're following along, I'll assume you already have an account. So what we want to do is create a cluster. So we can hit the button here to do so. You'll need to give your cluster a name. So this is going to be my video demonstration cluster. Now, we're not going to need any logging, so we can untick this box here. But if you did leave it ticked, then some logs would be written to an S3 folder. I'm only suggesting that we untick this because you're going to be charged for this storage. It will be a small amount, but it will be an amount nonetheless. And I guess it will be quite easy to forget to delete that. So let's untick that. Now, there's two options for launch mode. If we launch as a cluster, then what we're going to end up with is basically a set of Amazon EC2 instances that we can log on to and we can control programmatically, which is kind of full control of the cluster. With step execution, we can configure things so that the cluster starts up executes a job or a series of jobs, and then the cluster will automatically terminate, which is very useful if you've got a tried and tested job and you want to kind of configure it to run every Monday evening or something. Now, I recommend we don't go for step execution. Even if there's a problem with your code, and we are going to have to debug our code, then the entire cluster will shut down and you've got to start the whole cluster up again, and that takes ages. So although it's handy, step execution, and it certainly stops you forgetting to terminate the cluster, I recommend we go with this cluster option. Now, under applications here, we're going to select Spark, and that will give us a pre-configured cluster with Hadoop Yarn, the cluster manager as I mentioned before, a couple of other things, but importantly also Spark, for me at time of recording 2.2.1. Now, going a little further down, we can choose the instance type. Now, all you're getting here are regular EC2 instances. And if you pull up the list, this will be different, potentially, by the time you watch the video. But you should be familiar with these types of instances if you've done any work on EC2. Now, there are some instances here which are incredibly powerful instances, such as the C4 8X large. Now, they are powerful, but they're also expensive. They cost about $1.50 per hour to run. And we are going to have multiple instances in our cluster, of course. So the costs of that can really rack up severely. So I recommend when you're testing, I would avoid any of those expensive instance types. Now, I must admit, I don't use all of these instance types. I think probably for the course we want to use the cheapest possible, which surprisingly actually there is still the M1 medium available, which is a very old instance type from years ago. It says there it is previous generation. Now notice going to the current generations there aren't any actual mediums supported anymore. But the reason for that is probably just that these instances are getting cheaper over time with successive generations. And I noticed that the M1 medium, time of recording, costs about 8.7 cents per hour, or $0.087 per hour, which is pretty cheap. But actually, again, time of recording caveat, you can get hold of a C4 large for about the same price. That's 10 cents per hour. And that's a fairly powerful instance. As always, you'll need to check the Amazon EC2 pricing page for the current up-to-date prices. I'll follow the link to on-demand pricing here. And just to give you some ideas, as I mentioned, the C4 large is 10 cents per hour, time of recording. There's that C4 8X large, which is very, very powerful and very, very fast, $1.51 per hour. Of the mediums, looks like the smallest available are the M3X large and the M4X large. Pricing of those, well, they don't have the M3 on this table, but the M4X large, again, time of recording, 20 cents per hour. So quite a bit more expensive than the C4. There's a link further down the page to the previous generation instances, which it looks like, for me, the M3X large has been moved into the legacy generations. In fact, that one's quite expensive. That one's 26 cents per hour. Well, I won't go on too long about the pricing, but I want to give you a feel for the range of instances available, and this will change over time. I think just to be absolutely safe on the course, I'm going to go for what is actually a rubbish choice in real life, which would be the M1 medium, which is just fractionally the cheapest. It's not very powerful at all. It basically has just a single CPU with, I think, 4 cores. And it is definitely a sluggish performer, but we're not going to be running a big job on it. I'm going to start 3 instances, which will give us 1 master, that's going to be the driver, and there will be two core nodes that are going to be the executors or the executors. Now, again, I'm assuming you know what you're doing here. You will need an EC2 key pair. I'm just going to use one of my old key pairs that I use for demonstrations. So then you can leave the permissions set to default, and you should now just be able to create cluster. Now, I will warn you that especially with those M1 mediums, this can take a long time because it's going to instantiate those instances, but it also does things like patching them up with the latest updates, and it will also configure Hadoop, and it's going to configure Spark. So expect that to take, if you're using the M1 medium, it will be something of the region of about 15 minutes.
Okay, so while that cluster's starting, I'll just wrap this video up and we'll carry on in the next video. But I just want to remind you that if for any reason you decide to stop doing the work on this chapter, you must remember to stop or delete your cluster. If you don't, then you might find yourself with a very expensive bill from Amazon, and I cannot be held responsible for that. Always delete your cluster before you finish your session.